Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, April 29th, 2025. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, another massacre in Yemen, 68 killed by a U.S. airstrike on a migrant facility. So 68 people were killed by a U.S. airstrike on a detention facility for African migrants in Yemen's northwestern Sada province. And this was first reported by Yemen's Al Masirah TV. Another 47 were injured by the U.S. attack, which hit the facility early Monday morning. Footage and photos of the aftermath of the strike show bodies strewn in the rubble and wounded African migrants being treated at a hospital. A Pentagon official told Reuters that the U.S. military was aware of the reports of civilian casualties. The official said, quote, "We are currently conducting our battle damage assessment and inquiry about those claims," end quote. So I wouldn't hold my breath about the Pentagon coming out with much about this, because the Pentagon has shared virtually no details about its bombing campaign in Yemen, and U.S. Central Command acknowledged this on Sunday, as I mentioned yesterday. They said they claim that they're not sharing any details with us for operational security, so zero transparency about this bombing campaign. And look at this picture here of the wounded African migrants being treated in a hospital. So as far as I could tell from the pictures, videos, reports, it looks like all the casualties were migrants. So why would the U.S. bomb a migrant detention facility in Yemen? I can't tell you. And they're not giving us any real answers here yet. And there's precedent for this. This has happened before, believe it or not. The Saudis in January 2022, they bombed a migrant detention facility in the same area. It looks like, according to Reuters, this is actually the same facility that the U.S. bombed again. And when the Saudis did it in January 2022, they killed 91 civilians, according to the Yemen Data Project. So here we have the U.S. targeting the same facility. I don't know what the excuse is. I don't think the U.S. would purposely massacre all these African migrants in Yemen. So there must be some excuse for the strike. We'll see what comes out. But just a massacre, another massacre of civilians. And this strike on the migrant facility is the second deadliest U.S. attack on Yemen since President Trump launched his bombing campaign on March 15th. On April 17th, the U.S. bombed the Ras Issa fuel port in Hodeidah, killing 80 civilians, mainly port workers. So authorities in Yemen strongly condemned the U.S. attack on the migrant facility as a war crime. Yemen's National Committee for Refugee Affairs said, quote, "The United States of America did not stop at killing Yemeni citizens and targeting civilian objects in Yemen, but its heinous crime extended to targeting African migrants who arrived in Yemen in search of safety and stability. They were housed in a shelter center operating under the knowledge and supervision of the International Committee of the Red Cross and the International Organization for Migration," end quote. So you see the picture of the aftermath here. If you look closely at this picture, you see bodies in the rubble here. So many African migrants attempt the journey through Yemen on their way to Saudi Arabia for work. That appears to be where most of them try to go when they go through Yemen. So these are African migrants from the Horn of Africa, leaving war-torn countries, traveling through Yemen to try to get to Saudi Arabia. And Saudi border guards have been brutal in their efforts to keep these African migrants out. There have been reports, accusations of Saudi border guards slaughtering hundreds of African migrants in a single year with gunfire and artillery shelling. So a lot of times you see reports from Yemeni media since the 2022 ceasefire between the Houthis and the Saudis. There haven't been any Saudi airstrikes in Yemen. There's been some Saudi shelling across the border, but I think in a lot of cases, that's actually them just attacking migrants who are trying to cross the border. So it's just it's a tough situation for these African migrants to begin with, and then they get bombed in this detention facility for the second time. It's just really outrageous, because if the U.S. had any sort of real intelligence here, they would know that the Saudis bombed the same place 3 years ago, and they just killed civilians. So, I mean, I just doubt there's going to be any sort of accountability, any sort of answering for this massacre. So there was also, as I covered this yesterday, Sunday night, there was an airstrike on a residential area in Sana'a that killed at least 8 people, including women and children. So that happened as well. And then the Houthis, officially known as Ansar Allah, they announced Monday that they attacked the USS Harry Truman aircraft carrier and accompanying warships in response to these massacres. And now we'll see what happened with that. The next story here, U.S. Navy loses an FA-18 fighter jet during Houthi attack in the Red Sea. So a U.S. official has told CNN that the U.S. Navy lost an FA-18 Super Hornet fighter jet that fell off the aircraft carrier USS Harry Truman in the Red Sea during a Houthi attack on the U.S. warship. The Navy said in a statement that the $60 million jet, $60 million, and I think that's the lower estimate. I've seen other estimates that they're worth $70 million, even maybe more than that. That's just for one plane. So the Navy said that the jet was, quote, actively under tow in the hangar bay when the move crew lost control of the aircraft. The aircraft and tow tractor were lost overboard, end quote. The Navy said that the sailors took immediate action to move clear of the aircraft before it fell overboard, and that only one sustained minor injuries. A U.S. official speaking to CNN said that the FA-18 fell overboard while the Harry Truman was making a hard turn to avoid a Houthi attack. And earlier in the day, as I said, Ansar Allah announced missile and drone attacks on the Harry Truman. So some people initially think that this might be a cover-up, that the Houthis actually shot down the F-18. But based on my reading of it, I mean, we saw the Houthi announcement. They didn't claim that they shot down the plane. And I feel like this is even more embarrassing, that they had to make a hard turn and the plane fell off and sank in the Red Sea. More embarrassing than it getting shot down, maybe. But it also tells us something. I mean, if this is really how it went down, and the aircraft carrier had to make a hard turn to avoid a Houthi attack, that means that whether it was a drone or a Houthi missile made it through, air defenses to the point where they had to make a maneuver to actually avoid an attack. And I really do think if this goes on and on and on, this bombing campaign and everything, this war in the Red Sea, there's a very good chance of American sailors getting killed. I know U.S. Navy warships have like the most advanced air defenses in the world, basically. In one case last year during Biden's bombing campaign in Yemen, a Houthi drone made it to the last layer of, I believe it was a U.S. Navy destroyer, the last layer of those air defenses, which is essentially just a machine gun. So they used that machine gun to shoot down the drone. So there's always the chance of a drone slipping through, or a ballistic missile, and that could do some serious damage to an aircraft carrier, especially if you have the whole crew out on the deck. This is the risk that Trump is putting the U.S. Navy at by conducting this bombing campaign. And so what else is there here about this incident? So, this is actually the second FA-18 that the U.S. has lost in the Red Sea. In December 2024, so this was during Biden's bombing campaign, the U.S. military announced that it lost an FA-18 in a friendly fire incident in the Red Sea. According to reports at the time, the jet was shot down right after a Houthi missile and drone attack, suggesting it was mistaken for a projectile fired from Yemen. So this is another case. A lot of people think that the Houthis shot it down, and they did announce that the F-18 was shot down during their attack. But actually, if you read their statement at the time, they essentially said that it looked like it was shot down by the U.S. destroyer. So essentially, what I believe happened is that the Houthis were firing missiles and drones. This F-18 took off, and then a U.S. destroyer shot down the F-18. I believe that that's probably what happened here in this case. And then there's also the MQ-9 Reaper drones. The Houthis have shot down 21 of them since October 2023, and that each of them is worth $30 million. So then that's $630 million in drones, now $120 million in F-18s. So what is that? 750 million just in aircraft that they lost, plus all the munitions. The U.S. has spent billions and billions on this. And of course, one man's spending is another man's profit. There's a lot of profit to be made here for the military industrial complex. But I mean, this all just goes to show what a failure this bombing campaign has been. If the stated goal is really to stop the Houthi attacks on Israel and on the U.S., and the fact is that the U.S. launched this bombing campaign on behalf of Israel. They started bombing Yemen again when the Houthis announced that they would reimpose their blockade on Red Sea shipping in response to Israel violating the Gaza ceasefire. A senior member of Ansar Allah's political bureau has said that they would stop attacks on U.S. warships if the U.S. stopped bombing Yemen, but that they would continue the attacks on Israel. And the U.S. has showed no interest in that, despite Pete Hegseth and Trump himself saying that if the Houthis stop attacking U.S. ships, we'll stop bombing them. Well, they're saying that they will stop, but the U.S. continues to bomb Yemen because this is really about Israel, and that's what President Trump is putting the U.S. Navy at risk for Israel, not for the United States. No, it's a completely unauthorized, illegal bombing campaign, illegal war. All right, and it's completely immoral, as we see all these civilian casualties, of course. All right, so the next one here, Israeli attacks kill 57 in Gaza over 24 hours. So Gaza's health ministry said Monday that Israeli attacks killed 57 Palestinians and wounded 153 more over the previous 24-hour period as U.S.-backed Israeli strikes continued to pound the strip. The health ministry said that the bodies of 14 Palestinians killed in previous Israeli attacks were also recovered from the rubble. The ministry's numbers account for dead and wounded Palestinians brought to hospitals and morgues. So you see this picture here, a woman holding a child in a shroud who was killed by an Israeli attack. So Israeli attacks on Monday included heavy strikes on Jabalia, northern Gaza. According to Al Jazeera, 18 Palestinians were killed in two separate attacks on homes in the city. 10 members of the same family were killed in one strike, and 8 members of the same family were killed in the other. Al Jazeera also reported an attack on Gaza City that killed 9 Palestinians, including 4 children, and 8 were reported killed. 8 Palestinians were reported killed in Khan Yunis in the south. Gaza's health ministry said that since Israel resumed its genocidal war on March 18th, it has recorded the deaths of 2,222 Palestinians, so over 2,000 killed in just over a month. Since October 7th, 2023, the ministry's death toll has reached 52,314, and that number does not account for the thousands missing and presumed dead under the rubble or the indirect deaths caused by the Israeli siege. And the blockade on aid is still in effect as health officials are saying children are starving. I've seen pictures and videos of emaciated babies and children now. Starvation blockade, almost 2 months now. I mean, it's just the situation is as bad as it has been, as it could possibly get, with 100% backing and support from the U.S. All right, so the next one here, Netanyahu says that Israel will maintain military control of Gaza. So on Sunday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vowed that Israel would maintain military control of Gaza and said he would not allow the Palestinian Authority to replace Hamas. He said this at a Jewish news syndicate conference in Jerusalem. Quote, Hamas will not be there. We're not going to put the PA there. Why replace one regime which is sworn to our destruction with another regime that is sworn to our destruction? We won't do that. Israel will, in any case, control the area militarily. We're not going to succumb to any pressure not to do that, end quote. And the PA is all about, I mean, all their official stance is a two-state solution. That's not the destruction of Israel. And Hamas leaders have expressed support for the idea of a two-state solution as well. So Netanyahu has repeatedly vowed that Israel will occupy Gaza indefinitely, and his government has rejected Hamas's offer to release all remaining Israeli captives in exchange for a permanent ceasefire and Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. And in his remarks on Sunday, Netanyahu also praised President Trump's calls for ethnic cleansing in Gaza, which he frames as voluntary relocation. And when they met earlier this month, both Trump and Netanyahu reaffirmed that that's what they want. They want to remove the Palestinians from Gaza. So, and in, Netanyahu and other Israeli officials have made very clear that the goal is it's not about the hostages, it's about ethnic cleansing, it's about military occupation taking over the Gaza Strip. All right, so the next one here, Israel rejects 5-year truce proposal to expand operations. So this one is from the Palestine Chronicle. So Israel has rejected a proposal for a 5-year ceasefire in Gaza, which included the return of all detainees, Israeli media reported. So an Israeli newspaper, citing an unnamed senior political source, reported that the Israeli government is unwilling to agree to a truce with the Palestinian resistance movement Hamas, which would allow the group to rearm and rebuild its capabilities to continue fighting Israel. Meanwhile, Israel's Maariv newspaper revealed that the Security Cabinet will convene for its third meeting this week to discuss the possibility of expanding military operations in Gaza. 2 days ago, Hamas signaled its readiness to negotiate a deal to end the war in Gaza, which would involve the release of all remaining prisoners in one go and a 5-year truce. Tahir al-New, media advisor to the head of Hamas's political bureau, stated that the movement is open to a long-term truce but is not willing to surrender its weapons. Sources close to the talks told Reuters that Hamas seeks to gain support from mediators for its proposal, which includes a truce of 5 to 7 years in exchange for halting the war, facilitating Gaza's reconstruction, and engaging in a prisoner swap between the two sides. So obviously this is something Israel is not going to go for with everything that, they've been saying lately. All right, so the next one here, Ben Gvir meets with 4 GOP lawmakers. So Israeli National Security Minister Itamar Ben Gvir, leader of the far-right Jewish Power Party, landed meetings with 4 Republican members of Congress on Monday during a visit to Capitol Hill. Ben Gvir, an outspoken proponent of the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, told the Times of Israel that the lawmakers he met with included Representative Brian Mast, a Republican from Florida, and the head of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, who previously volunteered with the Israeli military and once wore his IDF uniform on Capitol Hill. So no surprise that he got a meeting with Mast. Mast is also a strong backer of Israeli settlements and recently directed his staff to refer to the Israeli-occupied West Bank as Judea and Samaria, a biblical name the State of Israel uses to refer to the Palestinian territory. Ben Gvir is a West Bank settler himself and wants Israel to annex the territory. So Ben Gvir also met with Representatives Jim Jordan, Claudia Tenney, and Mike Lawler. So shame on all these people for meeting with a war criminal like Ben Gvir, giving him any kind of legitimacy, any kind of time of day. The Israeli minister said that he did not come to discuss a particular issue, but wanted the U.S. lawmakers to get to know him. He said, quote, "I didn't ask them afterward whether they'll vote for Ben Gvir, but they wanted to get to know me, and I think they really liked what they heard," end quote. Ben Gvir said the lawmakers expressed their full-throated support for Israel and did not put any pressure on him to change policies. And of course, this comes amid this daily slaughter and the starvation blockade on Gaza. Ben Gvir has also called for Israel to bomb food and aid stocks in Gaza, bomb aid that was allowed in. And he said that he got support from senior Republican officials on this idea when he was at Mar-a-Lago last week. The Israeli minister has faced protests as he has traveled around the U.S. and was confronted by anti-war activists when he was on Capitol Hill. Medea Benjamin, co-founder of Code Pink, said in a post on X, quote, "Israeli war criminal Itamar Ben Gvir can't handle confrontation from protesters at the U.S. Capitol. As Minister of National Security, Ben Gvir has openly endorsed the ethnic cleansing of Gaza and intentionally bombs civilians, aid, and civilian infrastructure," end quote. So there's a video here of that confrontation. And there were a lot of other protests, especially when he was in Brooklyn. So the next story is about that. So I'm sure a lot of people saw these videos of these women. There was one video of a woman with a bandana on her face being chased by a mob of Orthodox Jews in Crown Heights, Brooklyn. There was a protest against Ben Gvir there, and there was counter protesters, and things got really ugly. And there was at least 2 women who were attacked by a mob. One of them was actually an Israeli Jew, according to her social media posts, and she was bloodied and like physically assaulted. And I mean, you just imagine if this Israeli Jew who was assaulted by a mob of men was on the other side of things. I was going to say, if she was on the other side, if it was pro-Palestine protesters that assaulted a woman who was, on the other side of the protests. It would be like a national scandal. But this has barely gotten any attention. And then this other woman was chased by this mob, and you could actually see in the video these men at one point threw a traffic cone at her, tried to hit her, and there was a lone NYPD officer trying to get her through the crowd. And it turns out, according to her account, she was not even part of the protest. She lives in the area and basically came outside to see what was going on. So I'll read the story. This is from NBC News. So a Brooklyn woman said she feared for her life as she was chased, kicked, spit at, and pelted with objects by a mob of Orthodox Jewish men who mistook her as a participant in a protest against Israel's far-right national security minister. The assault, recorded by a bystander, unfolded Thursday near the global headquarters of the Chabad Lubavitch movement in Crown Heights, where an appearance by Itamar Ben-Gvir set off clashes between pro-Palestine activists and members of the neighborhood's large Orthodox Jewish community. The woman, a neighborhood resident in her 30s, told the AP she learned of the protest after hearing police helicopters over her apartment. She walked over to investigate around 10:30 p.m., but by then the protests had mostly dispersed. Not wanting to be filmed, she covered her face with a scarf. She said, quote, "As soon as I pulled up my scarf, a group of 100 men came over immediately and encircled me," end quote. She continued, quote, "They were shouting at me, threatening to rape me, chanting death to Arabs. I thought the police would protect me from the mob, but they did nothing to intervene," end quote. As the chants grew in intensity, a lone police officer tried to escort her to safety. They were followed for blocks by hundreds of men and boys jeering in Hebrew and English. Video shows two of the men kicking her in the back, another hurling a traffic cone into her head, and a fourth pushing a trash can into her. At one point, she and the police officer were nearly cornered against a building, the video shows. She said, quote, "I felt sheer terror. I realized at that point that I couldn't lead this mob of men to my home, and I had nowhere to go. I didn't know what to do. I was just terrified," end quote. After several blocks, the officer hustled the woman into a police vehicle, prompting one man to yell, "Get her." The crowd erupted in cheers as she was driven away. The woman, a lifelong New Yorker, said she was left with bruises and mentally shaken by the episode, which she said police should investigate as an act of hate. And, I used to live in this area of Crown Heights. I lived in Crown Heights, an area to the south of it. And I lived in Midwood, which is a little further south in an Orthodox Jewish neighborhood. And Ben-Gvir went to a deli there that was kind of near where I used to live. And he went to someone's house for an event. So there's protesters kind of following him around the areas. And listen, I have a lot of Orthodox Jewish friends. I know a lot of Jewish people from New York. I grew up on Long Island. But seeing this story, because of the way some of the different groups are and the way that they kind of treat outsiders, this really didn't surprise me to see this kind of mob of these Orthodox Jewish men attack her. Again, there's all different types of strains of these Orthodox Jewish groups. And from going to pro-Palestine things in New York, there's always Orthodox Jews that show up to that too. There's the Hasidic sect, I forget what they're called, that are anti-Zionist. They're always at the protest. They were assaulted by counter-protesters as well. So, but I do know, there are some of these groups that are supremacists, and this is, they don't care about outsiders and they don't care about how the world would perceive what they do. All right, so the next one here, Putin says 3-day Ukraine ceasefire will start on May 8th. So on Monday, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced a 3-day ceasefire in Ukraine that would begin May 8th at midnight Moscow time to coincide with the 80th anniversary of the Soviet Union's victory against Nazi Germany in World War II. He said, or the Kremlin said in a statement, quote, "By order of Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, the Russian side, guided by humanitarian motives, announces a ceasefire for the celebrations of the 80th anniversary of victory in the Great Patriotic War to last from May 8th midnight to May 11th midnight Moscow time." End quote. The statement said that it expects Ukraine to follow the ceasefire and that if there was any violations, that the Russian military would be prepared to respond. Ukraine criticized the announcement, saying that if Russia really wanted peace, they would have declared a ceasefire immediately. This is Ukraine's foreign minister who said, quote, "Why wait until May 8th if the fire can be ceased now and since any date for 30 days? So it is real, not just for a parade. Ukraine is ready to support a lasting, durable, and full ceasefire, and this is what we are constantly proposing for at least 30 days, end quote. Putin similarly declared a ceasefire on Easter, but both sides accused the other of violating it. The announcement from Putin came after President Trump said that he believed Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky would be willing to cede his claim to Crimea, which has been under Russian control since 2014, to reach a potential peace deal. Publicly, Zelensky has maintained that he would never recognize Crimea as Russian territory. All right, so the next one here, Russia confirms North Korean soldiers fought in Kursk. So this one's from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. So President Vladimir Putin confirmed that North Korean soldiers aided Russia's military operations in Kursk, and it looks like Russian forces have now forced all Ukrainian troops out of the Russian territory. So Putin said on Monday, quote, "Our North Korean friends' move was guided by a sense of solidarity, justice, and genuine camaraderie. We highly appreciate this and are sincerely grateful personally to the chairman of the State Affairs Committee, Comrade Kim Jong-un, as well as to the entire leadership and the people of North Korea," end quote. The Kremlin explained the North Korean forces engaged in the battle for Kursk, and state media in Pyongyang in North Korea celebrated the North Korean soldiers' role in aiding Russia's victory in Kursk. So it was clear that we knew that North Korean troops went to Russia. They both confirmed that. But I think Russia denied that the North Koreans were actually fighting in Kursk, or they wouldn't confirm it. But there was all these reports about it in Western media. So now after the battle's over, they are confirming it. And they're saying this is a result of this new treaty between Russia and North Korea. So, you know, the fact that you have an alliance like this now and there's actually one side getting involved in the other's war is very significant, especially when we talk about the prospect of like World War III or something. So this is from North Korea's state media. It said, quote, "It is a source of pride for our state and a great dignity for our people to have such excellent soldiers. The victorious conclusion of the operations for liberating the Kursk area is a victory of justice over injustice, and at the same time a new chapter of history which demonstrated the highest strategic level of the firm militant friendship between the DPRK and Russia," end quote. So they did not disclose how many North Korean troops were actually fighting inside Russia. All right, so the next one here, Syria assures the U.S. that it poses no threat to Israel. So this article is from Jason Ditz. So the U.S. has been making these demands of Syria for sanctions relief, and one of them is that they want normalization with Israel. And now, essentially, Syria, it looks like, responded to, they submitted a letter back to the U.S. in response, and the letter made clear that Syria poses no threat to Israel, and the U.S. list of demands for Syria leaned heavily into placating Israeli interests. The letter addressed multiple U.S. demands, but it stopped short on a number of points, including the expulsion of all foreign Islamists, which, given the HTS's ideology, would amount to a substantial part of their new government. So apparently the U.S. said you got to get the foreign jihadists out of there, but that's a lot of the new government and the new military. They also wanted talks with the U.S. on some of the key points, including the banning of Palestinian groups. HTS recently arrested some Palestinian militant figures, which was seen as a good faith measure for the U.S., but it's not clear how far that will extend to banning Palestinian groups, period, especially those that aren't militant factions. Normalization with Israel would be a big thing for the U.S. to tout as a success in their engagement, but the potential obstacle is Israel's stance. Israel has invaded southern Syria, and they say that they're going to be there for good. So, you know, Israel might not be into this idea of normalizing. I think they just want Syria to basically be a weak state that can't threaten them at all, so they can continue occupying, you know, the Golan Heights and now this new territory that they've seized in southern Syria. All right, so the next one here, China and the Philippines clash over a disputed sandbar. So this is from the South China Morning Post. And you might be thinking, why would we care about a little sandbar in the South China Sea? Well, this is a big flashpoint, because in the South China Sea, China and the Philippines have this maritime dispute, and their coast guards often have confrontations. And usually whenever this happens, the U.S. comes in to remind China that the U.S.-Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty applies to attacks on Philippine boats in the South China Sea. It applies to attacks on any Philippine forces in the South China Sea. So China and the Philippines have clashed over Sandy Cay in the South China Sea as the two countries strengthen efforts to assert sovereignty over the disputed reef. The Chinese Coast Guard said on Sunday that it had handled 6 Filipinos who, despite warnings, had illegally landed on the reef in the contested Spratly Islands, saying that it violated China's territorial sovereignty. So essentially what happened was the Chinese Coast Guard landed on this reef, on this little piece of sand, and posed with a Chinese flag to assert Beijing's sovereignty. And essentially, it looks like the Philippine Coast Guard did the same thing a few days later. And again, this might not seem like much, but there's always the potential for some sort of clash. And this comes amid the U.S. and the Philippines are conducting these major drills in the Philippines, the Balcatan exercise, testing all sorts of weapons, and the U.S. is deploying new missile systems. The one that I forget the name of it, but that they specifically deployed for the Balcatan, it's like a short-range missile system. The purpose would be to fire it into the South China Sea. So, I mean, this is an area I need to pay more attention to, but tensions remain very high between China and the Philippines and the U.S. and China over this part of the world. All right, so the last story here. Pakistan defense minister says a military incursion by India is imminent. So this article is from Reuters. Pakistan's defense minister said on Monday that a military incursion by neighboring India was imminent in the aftermath of a deadly militant attack on tourists in Kashmir last week as tensions rise between the two nuclear-armed nations. The militant attack killed 26 people and triggered outrage in Hindu-majority India, along with calls for action against Muslim-majority Pakistan. India accuses Pakistan of backing militancy in Kashmir, a region both claim and have fought 2 wars over. So the defense minister said, quote, "We have reinforced our forces because it is something which is imminent now. So in that situation, some strategic decisions have to be taken. So those decisions have been taken," end quote. Defense Minister Asif said India's rhetoric was ramping up and that Pakistan's military had briefed the government on the possibility of an Indian attack. He did not go further into details on his reasons for thinking an incursion was imminent. After the Kashmir attack, India identified 2 suspected militants as Pakistani. Islamabad has denied any role and called for a neutral investigation. Asif said Pakistan was on high alert and that it would only use its arsenal of nuclear weapons if there is a direct threat to Pakistan's existence. So tensions continue to really heat up here, and I know they've been exchanging fire in Kashmir, Indian and Pakistani troops. Not clear if there's really been any casualties, but they've been exchanging fire for a few nights now. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from Ted Galen Carpenter. 50 years on, U.S. elites learned nothing from the Vietnam defeat. One from Paul R. Pillar. Trump can boycott, but the failure and end of Vietnam War is a fact. One from Ramsey Baroud. The dangerous precedent set by the persecution of pro-Palestine activists. One from Ian Proud. Covering up Ukrainian Nazis is nothing new. And our spotlight is from Spencer Neal. The starvation of Gaza. And that's over at the American Conservative. They continue to publish very great things about the horrific situation in the Middle East, in Gaza. So I think it's good to see a conservative publication, doing that. So that's it. Please go check all that out. Another reminder, I'm doing that debate on Wednesday about Iran, whether or not we should regime change Iran, and there's a link where you could register for that. Follow us on social media, Instagram, X, TikTok. Like and subscribe and comment. Tell your friends about antiwar.com and about this show. I will be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.